Just recently, we all know that Xi visited Putin in Moscow, where they discussed their relationship and obviously the war in Ukraine. But there has been a lot of speculation about the two sides, such as forming a new axis and about how the stage would be set for two sides in an upcoming crisis. About how this is totalitarianism versus democracy, but at the same time, you have the other side stating that this is an alliance that isn't rock solid. How this is just an alliance of convenience fueled by their disliking of the West, and how China just wants to use the world's events to its benefit.
Does this mean that we can expect Russia and China, two of the largest and most advanced militaries in the world, to team up and start taking on Western powers? Not exactly. Both countries are wary of establishing a formal alliance, largely due to both being expansionist powers and having conflicting long-term goals for their respective countries. During a summit with the two nations, both leaders were asked if the increased military cooperation between the two countries signified an alliance between the two. China's response was that the two are not allies, but better than allies. Now, on the surface, this might sound like Putin and Xi are best friends, but it's actually just a really clever way of saying that China supports Russia without any of the actual obligations that would have to come with a military alliance.
All things considered, China's growing military capabilities are great and all, but to magnify its power projection, it needs formal alliances. But choosing from a selection of strategic states is not enough. Strategy must be supplemented with ideology. History shows that a steadfast military alliance needs a common philosophy to glue its members into a collective mission. Something to justify its existence. NATO and the Warsaw Pact had clear-cut beliefs, which contributed to their durability. China, Russia, Iran, and Pakistan have little in common in culture or ideology. The only belief they share is anti-Americanism, but that is not much to go on.
A lot of commentators have gone this road, calling it exactly that, an alliance of convenience. In this video, I'm going to be on the other side of the argument, calling their claims to be nothing but candy coating and calling them out for not realizing the greater threat that really is. Here I'm going to list some reasons why Russia and China together are more of a threat than initially expected, and why they have more in common than just hating America. Critics of a Russia-China alliance never give the whole picture of history when talking about the two nations. The Russian Empire and Imperial China didn't have much contact before the 17th century. By then, Russia had spread to Siberia and it had become China's northern neighbor. But before that, Russian traders had met with Chinese merchants at the Asian trade routes in Bukhara. But the trade routes eventually grew and Russians did make it to the Chinese mainland. The first known Russian to have reached China was Ivan Petlin in 1618. He was a Cossack translator and a scribe. His visit led to more expeditions, and some trade started by 1640. But early contact was difficult, mostly because of language barriers and mutual ignorance. This period was marred by disputes and even led to a series of border clashes. Things did ease up, though, in 1689 with the Treaty of Nerchinsk. This brought a new era of peace, and even a trade route started between Nerchinsk and Beijing. Over time, this became a regular trade route even for Central Asians. Russia also became the nation that contributed the most to allowing the Chinese to understand about European culture when Latin-speaking missionaries settled in China. They even set up the Chinese Orthodox Church, which still exists today. Relations reached a low point in the early 18th century due to border disputes, but they were resolved by the 1729 Treaty of Kyakhta, and a new constructive relationship began again. In its relationship with Europe, Russia always had a special status in China. As Western European countries dealt with the Qing dynasty on a monarch-to-monarch basis, Sino-Russian relations were governed by administrative bodies, the Laifan Yuan and the Russian Senate. Russia was the only European country to trade directly with China, as their relationship was under the jurisdiction of the Mongolian and Manchu border officials. Russian Orthodox missionaries were also the only Christian group to be spared during the Qing dynasty's anti-Christian purges in the 18th century. Throughout the later 18th and 19th centuries, relations saw ups and downs, but they always concluded positively. The two countries formed an alliance in 1890 in order to deter Japan in the aftermath of the First Sino-Japanese War. In 1896, it expanded with the Lee-Lobanov Treaty, which saw China become a junior partner and protectorate of Russia, all at a time when various Western powers were succeeding in plundering the large Asian nation. This is in China known as the period of humiliation, and during this time, Russia was the only European nation that was friendly to it. The two countries even saw their monarchies abolished in the 1910s, with the Xinhai Revolution in 1912 and the Russian Revolution in 1917. When the Soviet Union was finally established, Moscow took to continuing trade with China, and in 1926, when the Chinese Civil War began, the Soviet government even went on to provide some support to the Chinese Communist Party. It was Russia that inspired communism to rise in China, as the Bolshevik Revolution and the ideology of Leninism gained traction among Chinese intellectuals in a post-imperialist era. The Soviet Union was largely seen as a big brother to a communist China, and it is by those ideals that the Chinese Communist Party still largely adheres to this day. You can still see portraits of Lenin all over official Chinese buildings, and the Russian government, who prides itself on its Soviet past, still has this mentality. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union and China were major allies and fought Western countries together in the Korean War. Relations deteriorated in the mid 1960s when the two sides had disagreements over how communism should be run. After the 1968 Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, Mao Zedong faced his greatest fear. He realized that the Soviet Union was willing to overthrow any government, including a communist one, if it wasn't subservient to Moscow. This led to relations hitting an all-time low, and the two nations even had a border war in 1969, which was a massive blow to communist unity in the Cold War. But as it always historically turned out, the border war ended and a status quo treaty was established. After Mao Zedong died in 1976, relations normalized and mostly remained stable. Two countries signed many border agreements and made multiple state visits. Even when Ho Chi Minh died, the two sides even went to his funeral together. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, relations started improving dramatically. Trade was increasing and it is still increasing, and multiple more border agreements were signed, such as the Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Friendly Cooperation in 2001. Even as far back as 2013, the two countries were committed to forming a special relationship. Now, this is all part of contemporary events, and I don't have to go into that, we all know about it. But the historical path of the two countries proves that their relationship is much like the one between the US and a lot of its modern day allies. Russia has always had a special status in the relationship between China and European nations, as it brought the most European attributes to China, and it even brought the very ideology that the Chinese Communist Party adheres to this day. To deny this would be to deny history. I made a video in the early days of Russia's invasion which I detailed this, but note that Russia and China have complementing trade requirements. China is the world's largest energy consumer, and it now has few friends that can give it the required resources in large numbers. Russia, with its vast natural resources, has been a very good provider of said resources, which is why pipelines and trade has been improving over the last few years. Russia, on the other hand, has always been in need of capital as it achieves slower economic growth ever since the fall of the USSR. Because China is the second largest economy in the world, it was always in a good position to invest in the Russian economy, especially now since they're losing their European customers. As a result of this, China has been Russia's largest trading partner since 2010, and Russia has become China's largest supplier of energy. I go into more detail about that in my previous video. Now, the economic ties also tag in to another problem. A lot of people say that Russia is now solely dependent on China as a result of the 2022 invasion. That Beijing has total control over Moscow and that there is nothing Putin can do. That it's basically now just a vassal state of China. That may not be entirely true. A big thorn in the foreign policy of China is as follows. A vast majority of China's oil and other resources come from the Middle East through the Strait of Hormuz. It grows across the Indian Ocean, and the fastest way it can get to China is over the Malacca Strait. The fear is that in the event of a conflict, a foreign power, possibly the US, can block the strait and basically bleed China both economically and of its oil. In other words, it's a fatal choke point for China. That is why China is looking to other resource-rich nations such as Russia in order to alleviate some of the pressure from the sea route. That is why several oil pipelines, such as the Trans-Mongolian pipeline, are being developed. This would reduce Beijing's dependence on the Middle East and give it a stronger arm in its foreign policy. It's also the reason why China has set up bases in the South China Sea to protect the eastern side of the Malacca Strait. It's the reason why China has set up a base in Eritrea. It's the reason why China has been gaining access to ports in Sri Lanka and Pakistan so that its navy would be better positioned to defend their cargo ships in the Indian Ocean. And it is also why they're seeking alternate oil sellers. And Putin is all too aware of this. Speaking of Putin, that leads me to my last point. Pro-Kremlin bots will talk about how NATO is aggressive to Russia by attempting to surround it. They will also claim the same is being done to China. China's access to the Pacific is severely restricted, as US allies Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, and Australia form an island chain that stretches all across its border. On the other side, across the Himalayas, Beijing is confronted by India, another US ally, and Vietnam, another nation bordering southern China, is a potential US ally. The only allies it has nearby are North Korea and Russia to the north. If Moscow loses the war in Ukraine, it would potentially be fatal for Putin. Not only that, but it might even cost him his life. But more importantly, it could bring about regime change in Russia. If a pro-Western government were to take power in the Kremlin, that would add another US ally, a very large one, on the border with China. That is something that the Chinese Communist Party would never stand for. That is why they are bringing up a peace plan to end the war in Moscow's favor. And if that peace proposal fails, they are willing to support Russia in order to make it win. They're already giving it lethal aid, as they are supplying them with rifles and body armor and are willing to push it further. That is why this alliance is more ironclad than you think, and more dangerous than one would expect.
Now, Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill has warned that the current global arena is as tense, she says, as 1940s Europe. Now, she stresses there's no war, there's no prospect of one at least. But James, when she says that we face the most challenging geostrategic circumstances since the Second World War, what's she referring to here?
Well, I mean, there is, of course, the war in Ukraine at the moment, but putting that aside, there is this, I think the thing that is the biggest, scariest parallel right now is the alliance between China and Russia, or the de facto friendship agreement, whatever they want to call it, between those two, which has huge echoes to me of the Ribbentrop Pact between the old Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. So, then it was Hitler and Stalin, now it's Xi and Putin. But, these sort of things tend to rhyme, and what happened there? Well, those two countries wound up, of course, fighting one another. I do think that China now feels like it has the whip hand against Russia, while we're concerned about Taiwan, quite rightfully so, and Ukraine, quite rightfully so. The geopolitics of it, I think Claire O'Neill, if she's going in the direction I think she is quite right to think that what happens between Russia and China could ultimately wind up being far more epoch-making. Remember, those two countries had a big border battle back in, I think, the 60s that came to pretty serious blows. So there's a lot of history there, and I think that's where she's going with this.
By now, it's obvious that the world is taking sides, but it's also clear that a lot of the arguments that these people make have holes, such as several YouTubers saying that in the future China will demand territory from Russia. If you actually look at the stats, China has a lower birth rate than Russia. So any claim to Siberia for the Chinese population would be baseless. The bigger threat that Russia would face is its autonomous regions in Siberia declaring independence. If we want to give Putin a headache, it would be a better idea to support those separatist movements. The same for Xi, as regions such as Xinjiang, Hong Kong, or Tibet want independence. Chipping away at their territory would mean less of Russia and China to deal with.